All right, one more
Absolutely.
screw and this
Here's
shelf is
keynote
officially
one,
built.
expanded to approximately
I can't believe
500
we
words
actually did
for
it.
I was just
Best
his
moving
tenant
day ever,
until
honestly.
one night changed everything. Hashtag keynote one. The ordinary beginning at first, the arrangement was simple. Renting his apartment felt like a practical solution, a place to stay without complications. He was the landlord, polite, professional, and distant enough to make the relationship uncomplicated. Our interactions were limited to signing papers, handling repairs, and occasional small talk in passing. There was a clear line, one I believed could never be crossed. The dynamic was straightforward, predictable, and entirely manageable. I noticed him more in subtle ways than overtly. His presence had a quiet authority, the kind that didn't demand attention but naturally drew it. I appreciated his attentiveness when issues arose with the apartment, his calm demeanor when solving problems, and the occasional humor that peeked through his professional exterior. Yet, I told myself repeatedly that admiration ended there. This was a transactional relationship, nothing more. I reminded myself daily that boundaries existed for a reason. Despite my attempts to maintain distance, small cracks began to form in the structure of our routine. There were fleeting moments, a shared glance that lingered too long, a joke that felt personal, a casual compliment that hinted at something beyond ordinary tenant-landlord interactions. At first, I brushed it off, attributing it to imagination or coincidence. But these moments accumulated, weaving an invisible tension that grew stronger with each encounter. The apartment itself became a backdrop to this quiet intrigue. Every visit from him carried a subtle shift in energy. The casual exchanges over maintenance or paperwork felt charged with unspoken layers, as if beneath the surface of ordinary conversation lay an unacknowledged connection. It was disarming and confusing. The professionalism remained, but there was something unsaid, something that made the air between us feel heavier than it should. I also noticed my own reactions shifting in unexpected ways. Tasks that once felt mundane, collecting keys, discussing rent, scheduling repairs, now carried anticipation. I found myself analyzing every word, every gesture, replaying interactions in my mind long after they had ended. The distraction was subtle but persistent, an undercurrent in my daily routine that I couldn't ignore. My thoughts betrayed me, hinting at curiosity and feelings that I wasn't ready to name. Yet, even amid this subtle pull, a sense of control lingered. I reminded myself of the professional boundaries, the rules of respect, and the simplicity of our original arrangement. I had no intention of overstepping, and I convinced myself that I could keep my emotions in check. But the tension was undeniable, and the ordinary beginnings of our relationship had quietly shifted. What started as a practical living arrangement was evolving, layering curiosity and intrigue over the mundane interactions of daily life. By the end of this period, one truth was undeniable: the ordinary had changed. A simple landlord-tenant relationship had begun to carry a weight neither of us acknowledged openly, and I could feel, almost instinctively, that everything was about to shift. That subtle tension, that quiet spark, was just the beginning of something far more complicated than either of us anticipated. Absolutely. Here's Keynote 2 expanded to approximately 500 words for I Was Just His Tenant until one night changed everything. Hashtag Keynote 2. Subtle shifts after the ordinary beginnings. The first subtle shifts began to appear, tiny, almost imperceptible changes that hinted at something beyond a purely professional relationship. At first, they were barely noticeable. A glance that lingered a second too long, a smile that seemed unusually personal, or an extra moment of attentiveness when addressing a minor concern. It was the kind of attention that could easily be dismissed, but it didn't feel dismissible. There was a quality to it that made the air feel charged, though I couldn't yet name why. I started noticing patterns in our interactions that hadn't existed before. Simple conversations about rent or repairs began to feel layered with subtext. When he spoke, there was a subtle warmth in his tone, a softness in the pauses between words that suggested he was aware of more than just the surface topic. I caught myself waiting for these moments, replaying them afterward, wondering if I had read them correctly. Each interaction carried a weight that both intrigued and unnerved me, and I found it increasingly difficult to approach him without a heightened sense of awareness. It wasn't just his behavior that shifted. My own reactions had begun to evolve. I noticed the rapid pulse when he appeared unexpectedly at the apartment, or the sudden awareness of my own gestures and words. Tasks that were once mechanical now carried an unconscious desire to impress, to be noticed, to elicit some small acknowledgement from him. It was as if the ordinary boundaries of a tenant-landlord relationship were dissolving slowly, replaced by something unspoken yet palpable. Small coincidences began to feel significant. A phone call that lasted longer than necessary, a shared laugh that lingered in memory, the way he seemed to remember minor details about my life. All of it created a sense that there was a layer to our connection that neither of us had fully acknowledged. I began questioning myself. Was I imagining this? Was he truly aware? Or was my mind amplifying ordinary gestures into something more meaningful? The uncertainty only added to the tension, feeding a curiosity I couldn't suppress. Even in professional moments, the tension was noticeable. When discussing necessary repairs or administrative matters, I could sense a subtle intensity, a focus in his eyes that went beyond routine professionalism. There was a magnetism in his presence that drew my attention, making it nearly impossible to concentrate fully on the topic at hand. I started finding excuses to extend conversations, lingering longer than necessary, and caught myself analyzing each interaction for signs of intent or shared understanding. By the end of this period, one truth had become clear. The relationship was no longer purely transactional. The ordinary had shifted, replaced by a subtle tension that neither of us openly addressed, but both were aware of on some level. The once predictable exchanges had become charged with possibility, and the realization settled quietly in my mind. Something had changed, and the dynamic between us was evolving in ways I wasn't prepared to confront. The ordinary had begun to unravel, leaving in its place a tension that hinted at a night, an encounter that could alter everything. Here's Keynote 3 expanded to approximately 500 words for I Was Just His Tenant, until one night changed everything. ####Keynote 3. The tension builds as days turn into weeks. The subtle shifts evolved into something more intense, a tension that was no longer easily ignored. The ordinary tenant-landlord interactions had been replaced by exchanges that carried weight, intention, and unspoken emotion. What had once been routine now held an undercurrent of anticipation, as if every glance, every word, and every gesture were charged with meaning. It became impossible to separate the practical from the personal, and the line between admiration and attraction began to blur. Each encounter started to feel significant. Even casual conversations about bills or maintenance took on a layered complexity. His attention, once professional, now seemed selective and nuanced, as though certain details or small gestures were intended for me alone. I noticed it in the way he remembered minor preferences, the way he lingered slightly longer during explanations, or the quiet moments when our eyes met and held just a second too long. The intensity was subtle, yet unmistakable, and it left me acutely aware of the effect he had on me. I also noticed changes within myself. Simple thoughts began spiraling into deeper contemplation, wondering about the meaning behind his actions, replaying encounters in my head, imagining scenarios that stretched far beyond reality. The distraction became consuming, affecting my focus during daily routines and even personal time. Tasks that should have been mundane now carried layers of self-consciousness. Did I say the right thing? Did I appear too eager or too distant? Each interaction left traces of excitement, curiosity, and anxiety that I couldn't shake. Even ordinary gestures felt amplified. A casual smile felt like an invitation, a passing touch, an electric spark. It became difficult to differentiate between normal human interaction and a signal that suggested something more. The awareness of this tension was both thrilling and unsettling. It awakened a curiosity that I couldn't suppress, a desire to understand what he felt and whether the subtle attention I received was intentional. Every encounter became a delicate dance, a careful balance between acknowledging the connection and maintaining the boundary I knew I shouldn't cross. The environment itself seemed to mirror this tension. The apartment, once a simple place to live, now felt charged with expectation. Every visit, every conversation, every interaction was a potential catalyst for change. I found myself analyzing the space, the timing, and even the way we moved around it, searching for clues in his behavior or signals of mutual awareness. It was as if the ordinary walls of the apartment had transformed into a stage for a complex, unspoken drama, one that I was only beginning to understand. By the end of this period, it was undeniable. The dynamic had shifted entirely. The distraction was no longer a passing curiosity. It was a force that demanded attention, shaping my thoughts, emotions, and even my actions. The ordinary tenant-landlord relationship had dissolved, leaving behind tension, anticipation, and the quiet certainty that something significant was about to happen. That night, the one that would change everything, loomed ahead, carrying the weight of all these accumulated moments, and I couldn't escape the sense that nothing would ever be the same again. Here's Keynote 4 expanded to approximately 500 words for I Was Just His Tenant, until one night changed everything. #####, Keynote 4. The night approaches the tension that had been simmering for weeks reached a point where it could no longer be ignored. Each interaction, each glance, each subtle gesture had built a quiet anticipation that seemed almost tangible. The apartment, once a neutral space, now felt like a stage set for something inevitable, something that neither of us could fully control. Every small encounter carried weight, and every word exchanged seemed to echo longer than it should. The ordinary rhythm of our interactions had given way to a charged awareness that made every moment feel significant. Leading up to that night, I noticed how much my thoughts revolved around him. Even casual moments outside of the apartment, walking to the store, preparing meals, scrolling through messages, were interrupted by flashes of anticipation or recollection of previous encounters. I questioned myself constantly. Were my feelings real, or were they simply a product of overthinking? Was he aware of the tension, or was I reading too much into ordinary interactions? The uncertainty created a magnetic pull, making me both eager and apprehensive at the same time. There were signs, small but undeniable, that he too was aware of the growing tension. He lingered slightly longer when speaking to me, asked questions that seemed personal but not overtly so, and his expressions carried nuances that were impossible to ignore. It was subtle, almost imperceptible to anyone else, but I felt it deeply. These small acknowledgments, this unspoken recognition of mutual awareness, created a sense of closeness that was both thrilling and terrifying. I couldn't help but wonder what would happen if the unspoken became spoken. The night itself approached with an inevitability that felt both exciting and frightening. The ordinary routines that had once defined our interactions now carried a sense of urgency. Every decision, whether to answer a call, open the door, or respond to a casual comment, felt loaded with meaning. The anticipation had become a force in itself, shaping behavior, thoughts, and emotions in ways that were impossible to ignore. The closer the night drew, the more aware I became of the fine line we were walking between curiosity, attraction, and consequences. There was also an undeniable emotional weight. The excitement was inseparable from anxiety, the thrill intertwined with fear. I felt unprepared for the intensity of my own reactions, the way my mind fixated on small details, and the way my heart raced at the thought of what might happen. The ordinary life of a tenant had been completely overtaken by this emotional undercurrent, and the realization that nothing would remain the same after this night was unavoidable. By the time the evening arrived, the tension had reached its peak. The apartment, the conversations, and even the silences all seemed amplified, each moment carrying the possibility of change. I knew that one night could alter everything, transforming curiosity into something irreversible. The anticipation was almost unbearable, yet there was no turning back. The ordinary had ended, and what awaited was a night that would redefine the boundaries, expectations, and the very nature of our relationship. Here's Keynote 5 expanded to approximately 500 words for I Was Just His Tenant, until one night changed everything. #### Keynote 5. The night that changed everything. The evening began like any other, with the ordinary rituals of daily life masking the extraordinary tension that had been building for weeks. But the ordinary facade quickly dissolved the moment our paths crossed that night. The apartment, usually just a neutral space, felt different, alive with anticipation. Every glance, every subtle movement seemed amplified. The air between us was charged, almost tangible, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for something inevitable to happen. He greeted me as usual, but there was a subtle shift, a softness in his tone, a lingering in his eyes, and a careful precision in his gestures. It was impossible to ignore. My own reactions mirrored his attentiveness. Every step felt synchronized in a way that neither of us acknowledged, but both felt. The casual professionalism that had once defined our interactions no longer existed. Something unspoken had emerged, something that demanded recognition. As the night progressed, ordinary activities, pouring a drink, adjusting a chair, passing a document, were infused with meaning. Every minor touch, every shared laugh carried weight. It was as if the world had contracted to the space between us, isolating us in a bubble where nothing else existed. The anticipation, once subtle, had become overwhelming, pulling attention and focus entirely toward him. Each look felt like a question, each pause an answer waiting to be discovered. I became acutely aware of the emotional tension building within me. Curiosity, desire, and uncertainty collided in a storm of feelings I wasn't prepared for. My mind raced, dissecting every gesture, every word, trying to understand if the attraction was mutual or if I was projecting my own desires onto him. The vulnerability was intoxicating, frightening, and exhilarating all at once. It was as though one night had the potential to collapse the boundaries that had kept us safe, redefining everything we thought we knew about each other. At some point, the conversation shifted from trivialities to something more personal. The casual comments about the apartment or daily routines gave way to small revelations, tiny glimpses of personality, emotion, and curiosity that had been hidden beneath the surface. Each word felt deliberate yet effortless, carrying layers of meaning that made the heart race. I realized that we were both testing boundaries, seeing how far the connection could stretch without breaking entirely, and there was an undeniable thrill in that dance. By the end of the evening, it was clear that the dynamic between us had changed irrevocably. The night had dissolved the illusion of neutrality, leaving only a raw, undeniable tension that demanded acknowledgement. The ordinary tenant-landlord relationship no longer existed. What remained was something unpredictable, emotionally charged, and potentially transformative. And yet, just as the moment felt poised on the edge of revelation, something interrupted the rhythm. A knock, a message, or perhaps just a pause that left everything unresolved. The night had shifted everything, but the outcome was still uncertain, lingering in the space between curiosity and consequence. Here's Keynote 6, expanded to approximately 500 words for I Was Just His Tenant, until one night changed everything. #### Keynote 6. The fallout the morning after that night arrived with a weight that was impossible to ignore. Everything had changed, yet nothing had been fully addressed. The apartment, which had once been a neutral space, now felt charged with an unspoken tension that hovered over every interaction. Each glance, each casual word, carried echoes of the night before. The ordinary rhythm of our tenant-landlord relationship had been irrevocably disrupted, replaced by a new, delicate equilibrium that neither of us knew how to navigate. It wasn't just the space that felt different. It was the way he moved, spoke, and even breathed. There was a carefulness in his gestures, a subtle hesitation in his tone, as if he, too, were weighing the consequences of every action. Conversations that had once been simple and transactional now required a careful choreography of words. I found myself reading between every line, analyzing pauses, searching for meaning in each interaction. The balance between curiosity, attraction, and propriety had become a tightrope that both of us were navigating with caution. I realized, painfully, that the fallout of that night extended beyond just awareness. It had stirred emotions I hadn't anticipated. Desire, confusion, and vulnerability intertwined, leaving me unsettled. My thoughts kept returning to fleeting moments from the night before. The intensity of glance, the brush of a hand, the weight of unspoken words. I questioned what those moments meant, whether they reflected feelings he truly harbored or whether my mind had amplified them in the quiet of my imagination. Each reflection pulled me deeper into uncertainty, making every subsequent encounter a minefield of emotion. At the same time, the tension was undeniable. Every shared space, the kitchen, the living room, even the hallway, was now laden with potential, as if the ordinary boundaries had dissolved, replaced by anticipation and curiosity. I noticed small details more acutely. The way he shifted in his chair, the way his eyes lingered on mine, the subtle inflection in his voice. These were ordinary gestures, but now they carried extraordinary significance, creating a constant awareness that I could neither ignore nor fully embrace. Despite the emotional intensity, there was a silent understanding that nothing could be rushed. Both of us were acutely aware of the professional boundaries, of the complications that had always existed in our dynamic. Yet the night had opened a door that could never be closed, leaving us suspended in a delicate state between what was expected and what was desired. The fallout was not just emotional. It was a reckoning of choices, boundaries, and consequences that demanded careful navigation. By the end of this period, the truth was unavoidable. The ordinary relationship had been irrevocably transformed. The night had left its mark, creating a tension that neither of us could dismiss and emotions that could no longer be contained. Every interaction now carried the potential to tip the balance, to reveal feelings, or to create distance. The fallout was not a single moment, but a series of lingering effects. Moments of hesitation, glances that spoke volumes, and an unspoken awareness that our connection had changed everything, forever. Here's Keynote 7 expanded to approximately 500 words for I Was Just His Tenant. Until one night changed everything. ####Keynote 7. The lingering tension weeks passed after that night, but nothing returned to what it had been. The apartment, once a neutral and predictable space, now felt layered with unspoken meaning. Every interaction carried echoes of the past, and the ordinary tenant-landlord dynamic had dissolved into something far more complex. Each glance and word was loaded with possibility, leaving an unshakable tension that seemed to hang in the air like a storm waiting to break. I noticed how much the smallest details mattered now. A brief smile could make the heart race. A casual comment could be dissected for hidden meaning. Ordinary moments had transformed into a series of emotional minefields. The once clear boundaries were now hazy, forcing constant vigilance, careful navigation, and a heightened awareness of each gesture. Even the silence between us carried weight. Silences that could speak louder than words, silences that hinted at desire, curiosity, and perhaps hesitation. There was also a sense of self-awareness I hadn't expected. I became more attuned to my own feelings, recognizing the pull he exerted on my thoughts and emotions. It was thrilling and frightening at the same time. Each memory of that night, the shared laughter, the subtle touches, the charged glances, surfaced repeatedly, forcing me to confront emotions I hadn't prepared for. The ordinary life I had maintained as a tenant was gone, replaced by the constant awareness of what had shifted between us. He, too, seemed changed. While still maintaining professionalism, There were subtle hints of the night lingering in his expressions, his gestures, and the way he interacted with me. Moments of warmth, attentiveness, or hesitation were amplified now, carrying a dual meaning that was impossible to ignore. It became clear that the night had left its mark on him as well, shaping his behavior in ways that suggested awareness, curiosity, or perhaps even desire. The tension was mutual, unspoken yet undeniable, creating a dynamic that neither of us could fully articulate. The lingering tension created a strange balance between fear and excitement. On one hand, the uncertainty of what he might feel or do next was unnerving. On the other hand, that uncertainty kept every interaction charged with possibility, infusing ordinary moments with a quiet intensity. It was as if life itself had been transformed, and every meeting, every conversation, every glance had the potential to shift the delicate balance further. Ultimately, the night had changed everything, but it hadn't provided closure. Instead, it had opened a space for reflection, curiosity, and possibility, an emotional landscape that demanded patience, caution, and attention. The ordinary world of tenant-landlord interactions had vanished, replaced by a tension-filled reality that neither of us could ignore. The connection was undeniable, the desire palpable, and the next step uncertain. And yet, there was an unspoken understanding. The story wasn't over. Each encounter, each glance, each word could tip the balance, moving us closer to clarity or deeper into uncertainty. The night had set everything in motion, leaving a lingering tension that hinted at change, but the full resolution, the moment of truth, was still to come.